In the dead of winter 1851, beneath the icy stones of Salem, Massachusetts, a schoolteacher named Elizabeth Hartwell descended into the basement of St. Catherine's Academy for young ladies and stepped directly into a nightmare. What she discovered behind a false wall in what appeared to be an unused storage chamber would haunt her dreams until her final breath. There, hidden from the world and time itself, were 24 tiny beds. Each was fitted with iron shackles, rusted but unmistakably functional, bolted into the headboards. These were not beds of rest. They were instruments of control. Beside each bed lay a single item, what might have once brought comfort to a child. A torn cloth doll, its button eyes missing. A silk ribbon stained by time. A small wooden crucifix, its edges worn smooth from prayer or fear. But it was what was written on the crumbling wall that turned Elizabeth's blood to ice. Scrawled in a trembling, childish hand were 5 chilling words. "We are still here." She reported what she saw, wrote it down, filed it with the proper authorities, and was never heard from again in the public record. Her report vanished, buried so deep that even whispers of it faded from memory, until 1987, more than a century later, when renovation workers repairing the chapel altar unearthed a sealed mason jar behind a loose stone. Inside was Elizabeth's original handwritten testimony, preserved like a time capsule of horror. And what that letter revealed would shatter the illusion of what St. Catherine's Academy had claimed to be for nearly 150 years. It was not a sanctuary. It was a place of ritualized suffering, a prison, a well-oiled machine disguised in faith and lace, operated by 3 women who called themselves nuns and who had history would come to learn, killed to protect their secret. But before we can uncover what truly happened to those 24 lost girls, we must understand how it all began. You see, here on Sleepy History Tales, we don't just tell stories. We dig up the bones that polite history tried to bury. If you're still with us, that means you're ready to hear what really happened on Gallows Hill Road. If you haven't already subscribed, tap the notification bell and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from tonight? Because this story changes everything. The year was 1834. The air in Massachusetts crackled with the energy of progress. The Industrial Revolution had transformed cities like Boston, Lowell, and Worcester into booming centers of trade, textile, and ambition. But with every booming factory and every growing mill came an unintended consequence: children, alone, everywhere. The streets of Salem and its neighboring towns were filling with orphans, children whose parents had been lost to consumption, cholera factory fires, or grinding poverty. These were not just statistics. These were daughters mostly left behind by a society too busy to care. And then came salvation, or so it seemed. Perched atop the ominously named Gallows Hill Road, an imposing brick building began to stir with life once again. Once the estate of a wealthy merchant family, it had been long abandoned. But now, under the name St. Catherine's Academy for Young Ladies, it opened its arched oak doors to the public with a promise: to provide orphaned girls ages 12 to 17 with a future filled with moral instruction, Christian discipline, and placement in respectable, God-fearing households. The building itself was a Gothic monument to trust and tradition. Steeply gabled roofs, narrow stained glass windows, and a wrought iron gate that groaned like a voice from the grave. Its promotional leaflets, printed on fine parchment and sent across New England, promised more than shelter. They promised transformation. Under their care, the girls would become governesses, school teachers, or the wives of Christian gentlemen. No child need worry. No parent in their death need grieve. St. Catherine's would provide. The woman at the helm of this grand enterprise was Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, tall, austere, impossibly composed, with silver-grey hair wound tightly beneath her black veil and eyes like flint. Whitman inspired respect and some whispered fear wherever she walked. She claimed to have studied at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary and to have served in Catholic orphanages in Ireland, though no records of this would ever be found. By her side stood Sister Margaret Collins, the softer counterpoint to Whitman's iron hand. She was younger, with a gentle smile and a melodic Irish lilt. She taught music and literature to the frightened girls who arrived by train wagon or steamboat. Sister Margaret's soft words and lullabies felt like balm on a raw wound. Together they offered hope, but they were not alone. In the next episode, you'll meet the third member of their unholy trinity, a woman who wielded the Academy's rules like a blade, and whose name would become synonymous with the institution's darkest deeds. At St. Catherine's Academy for Young Ladies, grief wore many faces, but none more maternal than Sister Margaret Collins. To the newly orphaned girls, Margaret's warm smile and gentle voice offered the first kindness they had felt in weeks. She sang Irish lullabies in the evening and taught music with such tenderness that even the most frightened child began to believe she was safe. But while Sister Margaret wrapped herself in compassion, the third member of the Holy Trinity wielded power like a blade. Sister Agnes Murphy, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and sharper rules, Sister Agnes served as both the disciplinarian and business manager of the Academy. Every adoption request, every financial record, every movement of every girl passed beneath her ink-stained fingers. Her habit was always immaculate. Her rosary never left her side. Her word within the red brick walls of St. Catherine's was law. The daily schedule she enforced was more than strict, it was unrelenting. Wake before dawn, morning prayers, lessons in arithmetic, reading, writing, chores, embroidery, more prayers, no wasted time, no wasted words. Discipline, after all, was godliness, and Salem welcomed her. To the people of the town, the Academy was nothing short of a godsend. Finally, a solution to the growing crisis of orphaned girls. Even the Congregationalist ministers, despite their disapproval of Catholic traditions, offered praise. These so-called nuns were doing the work the Protestant charities could not feed in clothing and educating society's forgotten daughters. The mayor himself stood beside Mother Superior Whitman on the day of the school's dedication in September of 1834, offering glowing words of support. He spoke of Christian charity and maternal devotion. The newspapers ran headlines about salvation and moral renewal. They never questioned what lay behind the Academy's imposing front doors. The girls who arrived at St. Catherine's came from every corner of New England. Mary O'Brien, just 13, was sent after both her parents perished in a textile mill fire in Lowell. She was known for humming Irish folk songs under her breath, songs her mother used to sing at the loom. Sarah Thompson, age 15, came after consumption swept through her tenement in Boston leaving no one alive but her. Little Catherine Murphy, no relation to Sister Agnes, was only 12 when her father died in a railroad accident. Her mother, destitute and alone, placed her in the academy with promises whispered through tears. Each girl received the same welcome: a hot meal, a clean bed, a new grey dress with a white apron, and a solemn promise that when she turned 18, she would be placed with a fine Christian family, a family that would offer her the life her birth parents never could. From the outside, everything about the academy seemed proper, virtuous even. Visitors, when they were allowed, saw quiet girls studying in tidy classrooms. They saw plain dormitories modestly furnished. They saw the sisters in their black habits walking in prayerful silence. They never saw the third floor, which was always locked. They never asked about the basement workshop, which, according to Mother Whitman, was used for advanced domestic instruction. It was always mysteriously empty when visitors came. No one noticed that the girls who had lived there the longest never left. No one questioned why in 17 years of continuous operation, not a single girl had ever returned for a visit. Not one letter, not one wedding announcement, not one photograph in any Massachusetts family archive. They simply vanished. The first crack in the facade came not from Salem, but from the north end of Boston on a bitterly cold morning in February 1843. A young woman named Emma Prescott, who worked as a seamstress along the harbor, was on her way to work when she heard something that stopped her mid-step. A song, a lullaby. It came drifting down an alley between two crumbling tenement buildings, and it was a song she knew. It had been sung by her friend Mary O'Brien years ago when they had worked side by side at the textile mill. It was a lullaby Mary's mother had sung in Gaelic while weaving thread, something no one else in Boston would have known. Emma followed the sound heart-pounding to a second-story window, partially veiled by heavy curtains. The building was notorious a brothel whispered about in disgusted tones and late-night confessions. She peered through a gap in the curtain and saw her, a young woman with dark hair, familiar eyes. Even after 3 years, Emma was certain it was Mary O'Brien, but Mary no longer looked like the girl she remembered. Her hair was styled in an elaborate fashion, pinned high like the women who lingered near the saloon doors at night. She wore a silk dress far too fine for an orphan, far too revealing for a child, and her eyes, they were hollow, absent, like someone whose soul had been carefully, piece by piece, taken away. Emma stood frozen in that alley for what felt like hours. The song continued. The voice was unmistakable. Mary was alive, but not free. When Emma finally gathered the courage to knock on the building's front door, she was turned away by a towering man who told her plainly that ladies like you don't belong here. That night, Emma returned home and penned a letter to St. Catherine's Academy. She addressed it to Mary O'Brien, careful with her words. She explained she had thought she saw her in Boston and hoped Mary was well. She asked gently if Mary was visiting or if perhaps she was writing letters under a different name. A week later, she received a reply. It was from Sister Agnes Murphy. Mary, if it was truly. Mary stood by the window like a porcelain doll caught in a cruel tableau. The silk dress she wore shimmered under the lamplight, luxurious adult and profoundly out of place on a girl who had once mended her clothes with borrowed thread. Her dark hair was arranged in intricate coils, pinned like a woman twice her age, as though someone had tried to erase the orphan and replace her with something polished, something for sale. But it wasn't the dress or the hair that turned Emma's blood to ice. It was Mary's eyes, once filled with mischief and hope. Now they were hollow, dark pools of resignation that spoke of violence, of ownership, of silence bought and enforced. They weren't the eyes of a girl starting a new life. They were the eyes of a girl trying to forget she had ever lived at all. Emma stood frozen in the alley, the frigid wind curling around her ankles as the lullaby drifted down like a ghost's whisper. It was the same song Mary used to sing while working the looms. A soft Gaelic melody only a mill child from Lowell would know. She tried to convince herself it wasn't Mary, but her heart told her otherwise. And when she finally summoned the courage to knock at the brothel's door, a towering man stepped into the frame. With a sneer and a voice like gravel, he warned her, "This ain't a place for girls like you." He shut the door. And with it, Emma's innocence. That evening, she wrote a letter to St. Catherine's Academy. She addressed it carefully to Mary O'Brien and worded it kindly. She said she thought she'd seen her in Boston, wondered if she was visiting, and hoped she was well. She asked if Mary might write back when she had time. Emma expected a warm response, perhaps even a letter from Mary herself with cheerful updates about her new family. Instead, what she received was a chill in the form of ink. The response arrived a week later, signed by Sister Agnes Murphy. It was polite, too polite, polished to the point of suspicion. Sister Agnes thanked her for her concern but said that Mary O'Brien had been placed with a devout Christian family in Western Massachusetts 2 years earlier. The family had requested complete privacy. They did not wish for correspondence. They did not want contact with Mary's former acquaintances. Agnes added, with formality, bordering on ice, that Mary was thriving in her new life and had expressed her desire to focus entirely on the future. It was a neat ending. Too neat. But Emma was a seamstress, and a seamstress sees everything. She recognized the stitchwork of a lie. The letter's body was written in Agnes's practiced hand, but the signature sloppy, rushed, almost certainly written by someone else, someone who didn't want the truth sewn too tightly. Emma might have let it go. She tried to. But then 3 months later, fate stepped out of the shadows once again. It was a sunny afternoon at Faneuil Hall, bustling with shoppers and street vendors. Emma was selecting ribbon for a client when she saw them, a well-dressed gentleman in his 50s, leading a young girl, barely 14, by the arm toward a waiting carriage. The girl had light brown hair, freckles dusted across her nose, and a familiar curve to her chin. Sarah Thompson, another girl from St. Catherine's, another ghost from the past. But she didn't look like the cherished daughter of a respectable family. No. Her clothing was elegant, yes, but too revealing for her age, the kind of attire Emma had seen on women near the docks where morality dissolved in lamplight. And her eyes, they were the same, that same distant drained stare Mary had worn. That haunted glaze of someone who had learned that resistance only made things worse. Emma tried to reach them. She pushed through the crowd, called out, but the gentleman, cold and polished with the air of a man used to getting what he paid for, hurried the girl into the carriage. The driver snapped the reins. As the horses began to pull away, Sarah pressed her palm to the glass, and then their eyes met. In that fleeting moment, Sarah's face cracked, and Emma saw it, a silent, desperate plea for help. She didn't speak. She didn't dare. But her eyes screamed. That night, Emma sat by candlelight and wrote again. This time, she addressed her letter not to Mary, but directly to Sister Agnes Murphy. And she didn't mince words. She asked for the names and addresses of the families who had supposedly adopted Mary O'Brien and Sarah Thompson. She asked whether they were in Boston. She asked why, if they were safe, they were wandering the streets in fine dresses with hollow eyes. She ended the letter with a quiet suggestion that she might come visit the academy herself to inquire about other girls she had once known. The reply came swiftly, but it wasn't from Sister Agnes. This time it was Mother Superior Victoria Whitman who responded. Her letter was brief, courteous, but beneath the grace Emma could feel the steel. She wrote that Emma's continued inquiries were disturbing the peace of mind of girls who were thriving in their new lives. She suggested with unsettling calm that Emma's imagination might be leading her to see familiar faces where none existed. She warned gently but unmistakably that Emma would be wise to focus on her own circumstances rather than dwell on the past. And then came the final line, a line that would haunt Emma Prescott for years to come. Young women who persist in pursuing matters that do not concern them often find that their own safety and reputation may be called into question. I trust that a sensible girl like yourself will understand the wisdom of allowing sleeping dogs to lie. And music fades into a low drone, as though something old has begun to stir beneath the surface. Emma understood the message. She had poked a sleeping dog, but what stirred beneath that dog's fur wasn't flesh and bone. It was rot. It was secrets. It was the whispering bones of missing girls who had never truly left St. Catherine's Academy, and Emma was now the only one listening. I trust the letter read that a sensible girl like yourself will understand the wisdom of allowing sleeping dogs to lie. Emma sat in silence. The words burned into her memory like an ember held too long. It was no longer just a question of where Mary or Sarah had gone. It was what had happened to them, and how many others had vanished behind the iron gates of St. Catherine's Academy. 2 girls gone, 2 girls who were supposed to be nestled safely in the bosom of Christian families, now draped in silk, hollow-eyed walking, silently beside wealthy men whose names no one dared speak aloud. Whatever had begun at St. Catherine's, it was not an act of charity. It was a machine. And Emma Prescott had just glimpsed the gears, teeth smeared with blood and silence. But what could she do? She was alone. She was a seamstress with no influence, no money, and no protection. Every step closer to the truth carried the weight of a noose, and still she couldn't look away. Emma's suspicions might have remained just that unprovable horrors, whispered only to the shadows of her cold Boston room, if not for a storm that broke in the fall of 1847. By then, St. Catherine's Academy had operated for 13 years without interference. Its iron discipline cloaked in piety, its sins hidden behind sermons and velvet-curtained parlors. Mother Superior Victoria Whitman had become a celebrated figure across Massachusetts, traveling from church to church with her silver crucifix and her widow's smile, preaching about God's mercy for orphaned children. She was adored. which made her all the more untouchable. But success had made the sisters arrogant, and arrogance breeds carelessness. What began as a quiet scheme, placing girls with questionable families for charitable donations, had evolved into something far darker. They weren't simply farming out unwanted children anymore. They had become the primary suppliers for a network that stretched from Boston to New York City, a network of brothels, private collectors, and underground clubs where girls were sold as if they were silk or spice or tobacco. Girls who were trained, groomed, discarded. The turning point came in October of that year. A man arrived at the academy's gates under the name Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy merchant with impeccable manners and a peculiar request. He claimed his wife, an invalid, was in need of a companion. A young girl, preferably delicate, obedient with a background of modest refinement. He was willing to pay 5 times the standard donation. A request like that should have rung alarm bells in any proper institution. But for Mother Whitman, it rang the sound of coin. She arranged the meeting without hesitation. 3 girls were selected: Catherine Murphy, age 15, Elizabeth Porter, 14, and Hannah Clark, 16. Each had been chosen for their appearance, their docility, and their unfortunate beauty, the kind that made them prime inventory in the Academy's real business. What the sisters didn't know, what no one knew, was that Cornelius Blackwood didn't exist. He was a fabrication. Behind the alias stood Detective Inspector William Ashworth of the Boston Police Department, and he had been watching St. Catherine's for months. The case had begun earlier that summer when the body of a young woman was pulled from the cold waters of Boston Harbor. She was about 18, dark-haired. Her hands were soft, her fingernails clean. Not the usual signs of street life, but her wrists told a different story. Tattooed just beneath the skin was a simple black cross, and below it, the letters S.C. Ashworth had seen those letters before, always on girls who turned up dead, always wrapped in mystery and regret, always marked like livestock from a source no one dared name. But these marks were different, sloppy, amateur, as though applied in secret by someone without the tools of a professional, but with a terrifying purpose. To Ashworth, the SC could only mean one thing: St. Catherine's. And if he was right, then the house on Gallows Hill Road was more than a school. It was a factory of disappearance, a place where girls were cleaned, prepped, and erased. He had no proof, only whispers, only bones. But then Blackwood knocked on the door, and Mother Whitman let him in. She welcomed him with grace, offered him tea, and then she spoke openly, horrifyingly, about what made certain girls more valuable than others. She praised their youth, their innocence, and worst of all, their utter dependence. She promised discretion. She promised loyalty. She promised obedience. Ashworth kept his face neutral, but inside, the storm was brewing. He asked to meet the girls, and instead of showing him the common dormitories, Whitman led him down a different corridor, one visitors were never shown. What he saw made his blood freeze. The hallway was narrow, paneled in dark wood, and eerily silent. The rooms were small but lavish. Silk curtains, mahogany furniture, scented oils, Each chamber was a gilded cage, and the girls. They weren't dressed in modest grey frocks like the others. They wore satin and lace. Their hair was styled with deliberate sensuality, and their cheeks bore the powder and rouge of a parlour house, not a classroom. They spoke little, smiled faintly, and every move they made was careful, trained, calculated to please. Ashworth saw it immediately. These weren't students. They were products. But what chilled him most came not in the parlour. It came when he glanced through a side window on his way out. There across the courtyard, he caught a glimpse of a workroom dimly lit, lined with benches and filled with young girls. These were not the polished ones he had just met. These were girls with torn sleeves and blistered hands working in silence beneath the gaze of Sister Agnes. Girls whose value had expired. Girls too broken to sell. And somewhere Ashworth knew were the ones who didn't work, and didn't sing, and didn't breathe. He was no longer investigating a missing girl. He was looking at a system. A hidden economy built on lies, forged signatures, and whispered prayers. And at the center of it all was St. Catherine's Academy, that crimson brick cathedral of virtue, feeding a network so dark it would make the devil weep. He was no longer investigating a missing girl. He was looking at a system, a hidden economy, built on lies, forged signatures, and whispered prayers. And at the center of it all was St. Catherine's Academy, that crimson brick cathedral of virtue, feeding a network so dark it would make the devil weep. If you're still with me, then you've already crossed a threshold most won't dare touch. But the story isn't done, not even close. In the next chapter, we uncover the deep rot behind Dr. Nathaniel Webb's clinic, the man who kept meticulous records of injuries no child should endure, and the clients no court dared prosecute. So make sure you're subscribed and light a candle. The darkness is only beginning. Detective Ashworth had spent years in Boston's underworld, following whispers, collecting names, stepping over bodies no one claimed. But what he uncovered in the winter of 1847 was different. This wasn't the chaotic sprawl of alleyway brothels or opium dens. This was something organized, something refined, something disguised as virtue. The trail had led him through velvet-curtained parlors and exclusive clubs tucked behind storefronts that sold imported perfumes and lace. He had seen girls barely past childhood, dressed in silk, playing piano, pouring tea for men whose names appeared on judicial letters and church rosters. They weren't uneducated streetwalkers. They were trained, groomed, rehearsed. And the deeper he looked, the more often he heard one name whispered behind locked doors and among the ruins of silence: St. Catherine's Academy. Ashworth never found a ledger, no confession, no hand caught in the jar. But he noticed something far more chilling: the patterns. 13 years of missing girls. Always the same profile. Young, polite, orphaned, but placed with families through what were believed to be legitimate religious channels. Except they were never heard from again. No wedding records, no death notices, no school registrations, nothing. It was as if someone had plucked them off the face of the earth. The Academy's records told one story. The city's silence told another. And so Ashworth became Cornelius Blackwood and knocked on the door of the red brick institution atop Gallows Hill. What he saw inside would shake even the most seasoned officer. His meeting with Mother Superior Whitman took place in the Academy's parlor an elegant room adorned with heavy velvet drapes and portraits of saints whose gazes felt less like blessings and more like warnings. Whitman was all poise and polish. Her eyes were sharp, her smile as smooth as sacramental wine. She spoke not in hushed tones, but openly, almost proudly about what made her girls so desirable. She emphasized their innocence, their fragility, and most importantly, their total dependence on the academy. Some clients, she had said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, require certain qualities, and we do everything we can to ensure satisfaction and discretion. When Ashworth asked to meet some of the girls, he expected resistance. Instead, Whitman led him down a corridor he hadn't seen before, a section of the building kept well away from curious guests and nosy benefactors. This wing was different. The wood was polished, the wallpaper imported. The rooms small, private, and lavishly decorated in a way no orphanage should ever be. Silk curtains, warm lamps, and furniture that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Beacon Hill townhouse. This wasn't a dormitory. It was a boudoir gallery. The three girls presented to him were not children anymore. They had been sculpted into something else. Their hair was styled in elaborate waves, adorned with tiny pins and delicate ribbons. Their dresses were far too mature, their bodices tight, their skirts expensive. They wore makeup lightly, but purposefully applied. And most disturbing of all, they greeted Ashworth with a strange blend of fear and rehearsal. They didn't fidget, they didn't cry, they performed. Ashworth kept his expression neutral, but inside, he was screaming. He was standing in the middle of a grooming facility, a finishing school for exploitation, and these girls, these children, had no idea how far gone they were. And yet, as horrific as this hidden parlor was, what he saw next would never leave him. On his way out, as he was escorted through the side courtyard, something caught his eye. A dark window, faint candlelight, the sound of scraping tools. He turned his head just enough to see into what appeared to be a workroom, bare stone walls, low ceilings, no windows for air. Inside, several girls were bent over benches working in silence, their faces hollow, their hands blistered, their backs hunched. There was no velvet here, no lace, no music, only the sound of quiet suffering. And standing above them, arms crossed and eyes sharp, was Sister Agnes Murphy. These weren't the girls prepared for the parlor. These were the discarded ones, the ones who didn't please the clients, the ones too rebellious, too outspoken, too damaged. Ashworth realized the academy ran on a three-tiered system. At the top were the girls who brought the highest prices, the youngest, the prettiest, the most obedient. They were trained, styled, and sold. Beneath them were the girls forced into labor, used until they broke. And below them, somewhere in the darkness of that building, were the girls who simply disappeared. Music slows to a chilling halt, then silence. This was no orphanage. This was a harvest house, and Ashworth had just been given the grand tour. We often think of evil as loud, obvious fire and brimstone, but in Salem it wore a habit, whispered scripture, and served warm tea. In the next chapter, we meet the man who kept the most damning records of all, Dr. Nathaniel Webb, the Academy's long-serving physician, whose quiet notebooks would become the key to unraveling everything. So don't go far, because the walls of St. Catherine's are still whispering. Detective Ashworth had spent years in Boston's underworld, following whispers, collecting names, stepping over bodies no one claimed. But what he uncovered in the winter of 1847 was different. This wasn't the chaotic sprawl of alleyway brothels or opium dens. This was something organized, something refined, something disguised as virtue. The trail had led him through velvet-curtained parlors and exclusive clubs tucked behind storefronts that sold imported perfumes and lace. He had seen girls barely past childhood, dressed in silk, playing piano, pouring tea for men whose names appeared on judicial letters and church rosters. They weren't uneducated streetwalkers. They were trained, groomed, rehearsed. And the deeper he looked, the more often he heard one name whispered behind locked doors and among the ruins of silence. St. Catherine's Academy. Ashworth never found a ledger, no confession, no hand caught in the jar. But he noticed something far more chilling. The patterns. 13 years of missing girls. Always the same profile. Young, polite, orphaned but placed with families through what were believed to be legitimate religious channels. Except they were never heard from again. No wedding records, no death notices, no school registrations, nothing. It was as if someone had plucked them off the face of the earth. The Academy's records told one story. The city's silence told another. And so Ashworth became Cornelius Blackwood and knocked on the door of the red brick institution atop Gallows Hill. What he saw inside would shake even the most seasoned officer. His meeting with Mother Superior Whitman took place in the Academy's parlor, an elegant room adorned with heavy velvet drapes and portraits of saints whose gazes felt less like blessings and more like warnings. Whitman was all poise and polish. Her eyes were sharp, her smile as smooth as sacramental wine. She spoke not in hushed tones, but openly, almost proudly, about what made her girls so desirable. She emphasized their innocence, their fragility, and most importantly, their total dependence on the Academy. Some clients, she had said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, require certain qualities. And we do everything we can to ensure satisfaction and discretion. When Ashworth asked to meet some of the girls, he expected resistance. Instead, Whitman led him down a corridor he hadn't seen before. A section of the building kept well away from curious guests and nosy benefactors. This wing was different. The wood was polished, the wallpaper imported, the rooms small, private, and lavishly decorated in a way no orphanage should ever be. Silk curtains, warm lamps, and furniture that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Beacon Hill townhouse. This wasn't a dormitory. It was a boudoir gallery. The three girls presented to him were not children anymore. They had been sculpted into something else. Their hair was styled in elaborate waves adorned with tiny pins and delicate ribbons. Their dresses were far too mature, their bodices tight, their skirts expensive. They wore makeup lightly but purposefully applied. And most disturbing of all, they greeted Ashworth with a strange blend of fear and rehearsal. They didn't fidget, they didn't cry. They performed. Ashworth kept his expression neutral, but inside, he was screaming. He was standing in the middle of a grooming facility, a finishing school for exploitation. And these girls, these children had no idea how far gone they were. And yet, As horrific as this hidden parlor was, what he saw next would never leave him. On his way out, as he was escorted through the side courtyard, something caught his eye. A dark window, faint candlelight, the sound of scraping tools. He turned his head just enough to see into what appeared to be a workroom. Bare stone walls, low ceilings, no windows for air. Inside, several girls were bent over benches, working in silence. Their faces hollow, their hands blistered, their backs hunched. There was no velvet here, no lace, no music, only the sound of quiet suffering. And standing above them, arms crossed and eyes sharp, was Sister Agnes Murphy. These weren't the girls prepared for the parlor. These were the discarded ones, the ones who didn't please the clients, the ones too rebellious, too outspoken, too damaged. Ashworth realized the academy ran on a 3-tiered system. At the top were the girls who brought the highest prices, the youngest, the prettiest, the most obedient. They were trained, styled, and sold. Beneath them were the girls forced into labor, used until they broke. And below them, somewhere in the darkness of that building, were the girls who simply disappeared. This was no orphanage. This was a harvest house, and Ashworth had just been given the grand tour. We often think of evil as loud, obvious fire and brimstone, but in Salem it wore a habit, whispered scripture, and served warm tea. In the next chapter, we meet the man who kept the most damning records of all Dr. Nathaniel Webb, the Academy's long-serving physician, whose quiet notebooks would become the key to unraveling everything. So don't go far, because the walls of St. Catherine's are still whispering. St. Catherine's Academy did not simply break girls. It erased them. Some were groomed, packaged, and sold. Some were pushed into endless labor, their bodies traded for silence, and others too, broken, too rebellious, or simply no longer profitable, disappeared, vanished into the folds of Salem's holy veil. Detective Ashworth stood at the edge of a cliff, not just legally but morally. He had walked into the lion's den. He had seen the girls, heard the hollow rehearsals in their voices, smelled the perfume that couldn't hide the fear. But how do you indict 3 women who had built 13 years of untouchable sainthood? Women who were praised from pulpits and paraded as saviors of the unwanted. The town knew their names like a hymn. Mother Superior Whitman, Sister Margaret Collins, Sister Agnes Murphy. Saints, some called them. But Ashworth knew better. He had seen their altar, and he had met their angels. But the case needed more than observation. It needed a reckoning, and the first strike came from someone. The Academy had underestimated Emma Prescott. She had risked her job, her reputation, and now her life by stepping forward. She walked into the Boston Police Department with quiet fury and an envelope full of names, letters, and unanswered questions. Her testimony gave Ashworth something that had eluded him for months. A human voice. A voice that remembered Mary O'Brien's lullaby, that saw Sarah Thompson's eyes begging for help. A voice that refused to be silenced. But even that wasn't enough. The web stretched far beyond the Academy's red brick walls. Witnesses had either vanished or lived in constant fear. Records had been burned or never kept. Ashworth needed something undeniable, and that's when he found the key. hidden in plain sight. Dr. Nathaniel Webb. Dr. Webb was no villain in appearance. He was a man of 62, known in Salem for his quiet demeanor and old-world manners. He had delivered babies treated influenza, set broken bones. He had also treated girls who couldn't speak for themselves. Girls whose bruises told stories that sermons never would. The good doctor had been with the academy almost since its inception. In 1836, just 2 years after St. Catherine's opened its doors, he was called to examine a girl with what was described as a fall down the servants' stairs. But what Dr. Webb saw were injuries no staircase could inflict, torn tissue, broken ribs, and bruises in unspeakable places. He said nothing. He was paid handsomely, and he kept records. At first, the notes were clinical, dates, injuries, prescriptions. But over time, his entries grew darker, more detailed, more defensive. Whether out of guilt or fear, Webb had begun documenting everything, and those records, quietly stored away in a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a floorboard in his apothecary, became the cornerstone of Ashworth's case. Sound of flipping pages, each one heavier than the last. Dozens of entries, young girls aged 12 to 16, repeated references to accidents that bore the unmistakable marks of sexual violence, cases of gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, injuries consistent with restraints, forced penetration and blunt trauma. And scattered among the most tragic entries, this chilling phrase: unviable pregnancy, emergency evacuation required. The girls were not just being used, they were being destroyed. And then came the final revelation. In the margins of those records, alongside dosages and medical diagrams, were names, not of the victims, but of the men who brought them in. Men whose wealth and influence had shielded them from suspicion. Bankers, judges, pastors, politicians, even 2 names connected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. These were not desperate criminals or street-level pimps. They were the pillars of Bostonian society. Men who wore crosspins and gave speeches about virtue. Men who paid premium prices for girls like Mary, Sarah, and Hannah. With those records in hand, the pieces of the puzzle finally began to lock into place. Ashworth no longer had just suspicion. He had proof, but bringing these truths to light would not come without sacrifice. Because when evil is enshrined behind stained glass and golden crucifixes exposing it, can be as dangerous as it is necessary. And the storm was only beginning. In our next chapter, we turn to the moment everything began to unravel, the night the Academy's secret burial grounds were unearthed beneath the chapel floorboards. What they found was not salvation. It was silence, stacked, buried, forgotten. Until now, so stay close. And remember, some history was never meant to be uncovered. But you're listening anyway. Welcome to Sleepy History Tales. There were the girls who were used for manual labor within the academy itself, and based on the evidence he had gathered, there were girls who simply disappeared when they were no longer useful to the operation. The question that now faced Detective Ashworth was how to build a case against 3 women who had spent 13 years building reputations as devoted servants of God. They had the support of Salem's religious community. the respect of government officials, and the protection that came from serving what appeared to be a noble cause. But Ashworth had one advantage that Mother Superior Whitman didn't know about. Emma Prescott had finally found the courage to approach the Boston police with her suspicions. Her testimony, combined with the evidence Ashworth had gathered undercover, would form the foundation of a case that would expose one of New England's most carefully guarded secrets. Detective Ashworth knew that exposing the truth about St. Catherine's Academy would require more than his undercover observations and Emma Prescott's testimony. He needed irrefutable evidence, and he needed witnesses who could testify to what they had seen. The problem was that the operation had been designed to eliminate witnesses, and anyone who might have knowledge of the Academy's true activities had either been silenced or was too terrified to speak. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Nathaniel Webb, the physician who served as the Academy's medical examiner. Dr. Webb was a respected member of Salem's medical community, a man in his 60s who had built his reputation on his discretion and his willingness to treat patients without asking uncomfortable questions. What Detective Ashworth discovered was that Dr. Webb's discretion came at a price. He had been receiving payments from St. Catherine's Academy that far exceeded what any legitimate medical practice would require. Dr. Webb's involvement with the Academy began in 1836, just 2 years after its founding. He had been called to treat a young girl who had suffered what Mother Superior Whitman described as a serious accident. The girl, who was about 14 years old, had injuries that were consistent with violent sexual assault. Dr. Webb treated her injuries and was paid handsomely for his silence. Over the years, Dr. Webb had been called to the Academy dozens of times to treat similar accidents. Young girls with injuries that told a clear story of abuse. Others suffering from venereal diseases that should have been impossible for sheltered orphans to contract. And most disturbing of all, girls who required medical attention after what appeared to be botched abortions. Dr. Webb had kept detailed records of these treatments, partly out of medical necessity and partly as insurance against the day when his own involvement might be discovered. These records, which Detective Ashworth obtained through a warrant, painted a horrifying picture of systematic abuse spanning more than a decade. The medical records revealed that girls at St. Catherine's Academy were routinely subjected to physical and sexual violence. They were infected with diseases that could only have been transmitted through sexual contact with multiple partners. They suffered injuries that suggested they had been physically restrained and brutalized. And when they became pregnant as a result of their abuse, they were subjected to dangerous procedures that often left them permanently damaged or dead. But the records also revealed something else. Dr. Webb had been documenting the identities of the men who brought girls to him for treatment. These were not the Christian families who were supposedly adopting the girls from St. Catherine's Academy. They were wealthy merchants, politicians, judges, and religious leaders from Boston and beyond. Men who were paying premium prices for access to young victims. Among the names in Dr. Webb's records were some of the most prominent figures in Massachusetts society. There was Judge Harrison Cromwell, who had built his career prosecuting moral crimes while secretly patronizing the very establishments he condemned. There was Reverend Samuel Blackston, whose sermons about the sanctity of childhood had made him famous throughout New England. There was even Mayor Robert Thornton of Boston himself, a man who had publicly praised St. Catherine's Academy for its Christian service. Detective Ashworth realized that he was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond 3 women running a single institution. This was a network of powerful men who had used their positions to exploit the most vulnerable members of society, secure in the knowledge that their victims had no voice and no recourse. But as Ashworth delved deeper into the case, he made another disturbing discovery. Dr. Webb's record showed that many of the girls he had treated had subsequently disappeared from his care. Girls who had been severely injured or who had contracted dangerous diseases would be brought to him for treatment, but they would never return for follow-up care. When he inquired about their welfare, he was told that they had recovered completely and had been placed with new families. Ashworth began to suspect that girls who became too damaged or too dangerous to the operation were being permanently eliminated. But proving this would require finding evidence of what had happened to girls who had vanished without a trace. The answer came when Ashworth decided to investigate the physical structure of St. Catherine's Academy itself. Using his authority as a police detective, he obtained permission to conduct a thorough search of the building under the pretense of investigating reports of building code violations. What he found in the basement of the academy would provide the evidence he needed to bring down the entire operation. The basement had been divided into several sections, each serving a different purpose in the academy's true business. There was a workshop where girls were forced to produce goods that were sold to supplement the academy's income. There was a medical area where Dr. Webb had conducted his treatments away from prying eyes. And there was a section that had been designed specifically for the training of girls who were being prepared for placement with special clients. But it was the 4th section of the basement that provided the most damning evidence. Behind a false wall that had been carefully concealed, Detective Ashworth found a room that had been used as a primitive crematorium. The room contained the remains of an improvised furnace along with fragments of human, bone and teeth that had not been completely destroyed. Analysis of these remains would later reveal that they belonged to multiple individuals, all of them young females between the ages of 12 and 18. Some of the bones showed evidence of trauma that suggested violent death, while others indicated that the victims had been suffering from advanced stages of disease when they died. Detective Ashworth had found the final resting place of girls who had become liabilities to St. Catherine's Academy. Girls who had been too damaged by their abuse to be profitable. Girls who had threatened to expose the operation. Girls who had simply outlived their usefulness. All of them had been murdered and their bodies destroyed to eliminate any evidence of their existence. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In a hidden compartment near the crematorium, Ashworth found a ledger that detailed every transaction the academy had conducted over its 13 years of operation. The ledger contained the names of clients, the amounts they had paid, and detailed descriptions of the services they had received. It also contained a complete record of the girls who had been retired from the operation. More than 40 young women who had been murdered when they were no longer useful. The ledger was signed by all 3 women, Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, Sister Margaret Collins, and Sister Agnes Murphy. But it was also signed by someone else, someone whose involvement in the operation had been carefully concealed until now. The fourth signature belonged to Father Patrick Ali, the priest who had supposedly helped establish St. Catherine's Academy as a Catholic institution. Ali, it turned out, was not a priest at all, but another criminal who had assumed a false identity to provide religious legitimacy to the operation. Detective Ashworth now had evidence of a criminal conspiracy that involved not just 4 individuals, but a network of wealthy and powerful men who had used their positions to exploit vulnerable children. But bringing these criminals to justice would prove to be far more dangerous than gathering evidence against them. As Detective Ashworth prepared to present his evidence to the Massachusetts Attorney General, he began to understand why the St. Catherine's Academy operation had been able to continue for so long without detection. The network of clients who had patronized the Academy included some of the most powerful men in the state. Men who had the resources and connections to make problems disappear. The first indication that Ashworth was in danger came when his superior Captain Thomas Brennan called him into his office for what was supposed to be a routine briefing on the case. Captain Brennan had always been supportive of Ashworth's work, but his demeanor during this meeting was noticeably different. He seemed nervous, distracted, and reluctant to discuss the details of the investigation. "Detective Ashworth," Captain Brennan said, avoiding eye contact. "I've been reviewing your reports on this St. Catherine's matter, and I am concerned that you may be overreaching your authority. These are serious accusations you're making against respected members of the community." Ashworth was stunned. "Captain, the evidence is overwhelming. We have medical records, financial documents, physical evidence of murder. These women have been trafficking children for 13 years. Evidence can be misinterpreted," Detective Brennan replied carefully. "What appears to be criminal activity might simply be the result of poor record-keeping or unfortunate misunderstandings. I think it would be wise to proceed with extreme caution." That evening, Ashworth received a visit at his home from someone he hadn't expected to see. Judge Harrison Cromwell, whose name had appeared multiple times in Dr. Webb's medical records as a client of St. Catherine's Academy. Judge Cromwell arrived without warning, accompanied by 2 men who were clearly not court officials. He was polite but firm as he explained to Ashworth that the investigation into St. Catherine's Academy was causing considerable concern among Boston's business community. Detective Ashworth Judge Cromwell said, settling into a chair in Ashworth's parlor without being invited, "You've built a reputation as a thorough and dedicated officer of the law. That's why I'm confident you'll understand the delicate nature of the situation we're discussing. Your Honor, if you're here to discuss an active investigation, I should point out that this is highly irregular." Ashworth replied, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "Nothing irregular about community leaders taking in more interest in the welfare of our institutions," the judge said smoothly. "St. Catherine's Academy has served this community for 13 years. The women who run it have devoted their lives to caring for orphan children. It would be a tragedy if unfounded accusations were to destroy their good work." Judge Cromwell leaned forward, his tone becoming more direct. "I understand you've been talking to Dr. Webb about his medical practice. Dr. Webb is an old man, detective. His memory isn't what it used to be, and his records. Well, medical records from that era can be difficult to interpret. It would be unfortunate if an elderly physician's failing memory were to cast doubt on the sterling reputation of a charitable institution. The message was clear. Dr. Webb would not be available to testify, and his records would not be admissible as evidence. But Judge Cromwell wasn't finished. I'm also told that you've been corresponding with a young woman named Emma Prescott. He continued. Miss Prescott has been through some difficult times, recently lost her position at the textile mill, fallen behind on her rent, developed something of a reputation for instability. It would be a shame if her troubles were to worsen because she allowed her imagination to run away with her. Ashworth felt a chill run down his spine. Are you threatening Miss Prescott, Your Honor? Not at all, Detective. I'm simply observing that young women in precarious circumstances often find their situations deteriorating rapidly. Miss Prescott would be wise to focus on her own problems rather than involving herself in matters that don't concern her. Judge Cromwell stood to leave, but he paused at the door. Detective Ashworth, you're a smart man. Smart enough to recognize when you're facing a situation that's beyond your control. There are forces at work here that you don't fully understand, and people who won't hesitate to protect their interests. I'd hate to see a dedicated officer like yourself become a casualty of his own overambition. After Judge Cromwell left, Ashworth sat in his parlor for a long time, considering his options. He knew that he was facing a conspiracy that reached far beyond what he had initially imagined. The men who had been patronizing St. Catherine's Academy weren't just wealthy clients. They were judges, politicians, and business leaders who controlled the very institutions that were supposed to ensure justice. But Ashworth also knew that he might have one advantage. The criminals had become overconfident. They had operated for so long without consequences that they believed themselves untouchable. That overconfidence might be the downfall. The next morning, Ashworth made a decision that would put his own life in jeopardy. Instead of backing down from the investigation, he decided to accelerate it. He would gather his evidence and present it directly to the press, bypassing the legal system that had been compromised by the very men he was investigating. But first, he needed to secure the safety of the people who had helped him. He sent a message to Emma Prescott, warning her that she was in danger and advising her to leave Boston immediately. He also approached Dr. Webb and urged him to turn over all of his records before Judge Cromwell could have them destroyed. Dr. Webb, terrified by the visit he had received from the judge's associates, agreed to cooperate with Ashworth, but only under specific conditions. He would provide copies of his records, but he would not testify publicly. He was too old and too frightened to risk becoming a target of the conspiracy he had helped to enable. As Ashworth prepared to expose the truth about St. Catherine's Academy, he realized that he was racing against time. The people he was investigating had already begun to take steps to protect themselves, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their secret. The question was whether Ashworth could gather enough evidence to bring them down before they succeeded in silencing him permanently. The answer would come sooner than he expected, and in a way that would test every assumption he had made about the case. Just when Detective Ashworth thought he understood the full scope of the conspiracy, he received information that would change everything he believed about St. Catherine's Academy. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what Detective Ashworth was about to uncover. Because the truth about those 24 missing girls was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The revelation that would expose the true horror of St. Catherine's Academy came from the last person Detective Ashworth expected, Sister Margaret Collins herself. On the night of November 15th, 1847, Sister Margaret arrived at Ashworth's home in a state of complete terror. Her nun's habit was torn and stained with blood. Her face bore fresh bruises, and her eyes held the wild look of someone who had seen death approaching. "Detective Ashworth?" she gasped as he opened his door. "They're going to kill me. They know I've been talking to you, and they're going to kill me, just like they killed the others." Ashworth quickly brought her inside and secured the house. As Sister Margaret sat in his parlor, trembling with fear and exhaustion, she began to tell him a story that revealed the true nature of the women who had been running St. Catherine's Academy. "My name isn't Margaret Collins," she said, her Irish accent now completely gone, replaced by the flat tones of rural Massachusetts. "It's Martha Caldwell, and I'm not a nun. None of us are nuns, Detective. We're criminals, murderers who have been using that academy to destroy children for 13 years. The woman who had called herself Sister Margaret began to tell Ashworth the real story of St. Catherine's Academy. She, Victoria Whitman, and Agnes Murphy had met in the Massachusetts State Prison for Women in 1833, where they were serving sentences for various crimes, fraud, theft, and in Murphy's case, the murder of her own husband for his insurance money. Victoria was the smartest of us. Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been educated at a real finishing school before her family lost their money. She knew how to talk like a lady, how to carry herself, how to convince people that she was something she wasn't. When we were released in early 1834, she came to us with a plan. The plan had been audacious in its simplicity. Victoria Whitman had learned that there were 3 actual nuns, Sister Catherine Morrison, Sister Mary Frances, and Sister Teresa Walsh, who had been traveling from Ireland to establish a Catholic orphanage in Massachusetts. The nuns were traveling alone, carrying the documentation and funding they needed to start their new mission. Victoria arranged to meet them when their ship docked in Boston. Martha said, her voice breaking with the memory. "We told them we were devout Catholic women who wanted to help with their mission. We offered to guide them to Salem, where they planned to establish their academy. The 3 genuine nuns never made it to Salem alive. On a remote stretch of road between Boston and Salem, Victoria Whitman and her accomplices murdered the women they were supposed to be helping. They took their documents, their money, and most importantly, their identities. We buried them in a field outside of Marblehead," Martha whispered. Victoria said that dead nuns couldn't contradict our story. We burned their real clothing and put on their habits. When we arrived in Salem, we became Sister Victoria, Sister Margaret, and Sister Agnes. The false documentation had been easy to maintain because few people in Protestant Massachusetts were familiar with Catholic hierarchy and procedures. The women's claims about their background and authority were accepted without question, and their mission to help orphaned children was welcomed by the community. For the first year, we actually tried to run a legitimate orphanage, Martha continued. We thought we could take the money we had stolen from the real nuns and build a life for ourselves. But Victoria had bigger plans. She realized that there was much more money to be made from the girls than from simply caring for them. The transition from legitimate orphanage to trafficking operation had been gradual. It began when a wealthy Boston merchant approached Victoria Whitman about adopting a girl, but made it clear that his intentions were not paternal. Victoria realized that there were men willing to pay extraordinary sums for access to young vulnerable girls who had no family to protect them. Victoria started by identifying girls who wouldn't be missed, Martha explained. Girls who had no relatives, no friends outside the academy, no one who would ask questions if they disappeared. She would tell the community that these girls had been placed with wonderful families, and everyone believed her because she was Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, a devoted servant of God. But the operation had grown far beyond what Martha had ever imagined it would become. What had started as selling a few girls to wealthy perverts had evolved into a sophisticated network that supplied children to brothel throughout New England. The academy became a recruitment center, a training facility, and ultimately a disposal site for girls who were no longer useful. The basement workshop wasn't for teaching domestic skills. Martha said, her voice filled with horror at her own memories. It was where we broke them, where we taught them to submit, to obey, to accept that their bodies weren't their own anymore. Girls who resisted were beaten until they learned compliance. Girls who tried to escape were made examples of. Martha described a systematic process of psychological and physical abuse designed to strip the girls of their will to resist. New arrivals were isolated from the other girls and subjected to increasingly severe punishments until they accepted their fate. Girls who showed particular beauty or refinement were given special training that prepared them for the most wealthy and demanding clients. Victoria had lists, Martha said, lists of clients and their specific requirements. Some men wanted girls who looked like their own daughters. Others wanted girls who reminded them of their dead wives. There were men who paid extra for girls who would cry, and men who paid extra for girls who wouldn't. The most disturbing revelation was what happened to girls who became pregnant, contracted diseases, or simply aged out of their usefulness. Dr. Webb's treatments had been attempts to maintain the girls' value as commodities. But when those treatments failed, the girls were eliminated. Victoria called it retirement. Martha said the euphemism sounding obscene in the context of child murder. Agnes would take them down to the basement and they would never come back. At first, Victoria told me, they were being sent to other institutions, but I knew that wasn't true. I could smell the smoke from the crematorium, could see the ashes that Agnes scattered in the garden behind the academy. Martha estimated that more than 60 girls had been retired over the 13 years of the academy's operation. Some had been murdered outright when they became liabilities. Others had died from the abuse they suffered, and still others had been killed when they threatened to expose the operation. The 24 girls you're looking for, Martha, said, they're not missing. They're dead. Every single one of them. Victoria kept a record of their names because she was proud of what she had built. She called them her greatest successes girls who had generated the most money before they were eliminated. But Martha's most shocking revelation was about the scope of the conspiracy. The network of clients wasn't limited to Boston or even Massachusetts. Victoria Whitman had established connections with similar operations throughout New England and New York, creating a regional network that treated girls like commodities. There are other places like St. Catherine's. Martha said Victoria was in communication with people running similar operations in Connecticut, Rhode Island, even as far away as Philadelphia. They would trade girls, share clients, help each other eliminate problems. It's not just one academy detective, it's dozens of them. Martha had finally decided to come forward because she had learned that Victoria and Agnes were planning to eliminate her. Her growing reluctance to participate in the most violent aspects of the operation had made her a liability, and she had overheard them discussing the best way to arrange her accident. "I never wanted it to go this far," she said, tears streaming down her face. "When we started, I thought we were just going to steal some money and disappear. I never imagined we would become what we became. I've helped murder children, detective. I've helped destroy dozens of innocent lives, and I can't live with it anymore." Martha offered to provide Ashworth with everything he needed to expose the operation. The location of the mass grave where the real nuns were buried, the names and locations of other similar operations, detailed records of clients and transactions, and most importantly, the location where Victoria Whitman kept her most incriminating evidence. "Victoria keeps everything in a safe in her private quarters." Martha said financial records, client lists, photographs that clients paid extra for correspondence with other operations. She thinks it makes her powerful having evidence that could destroy so many important men. But it's also evidence that could destroy her. As Martha finished her confession, Ashworth realized that he was looking at the biggest criminal conspiracy in Massachusetts history. But he also realized that exposing it would be incredibly dangerous. The men who had been clients of St. Catherine's Academy would do anything to prevent their crimes from becoming public. And they had the resources to eliminate anyone who threatened them. The question was whether Ashworth could move fast enough to gather the evidence and present it to the public before the conspiracy could silence him and Martha permanently. The answer would determine not only whether justice would be served, but whether the girls who had died at St. Catherine's Academy would finally be remembered for who they truly were, victims of a system that had failed to protect them. Detective Ashworth knew that he had only hours before Victoria Whitman and Agnes Murphy realized that Martha had betrayed them. With Martha's help, he organized a raid on St. Catherine's Academy that would take place at dawn on November 16, 1847. He bypassed his own department, knowing that the conspiracy reached into the Boston police, and instead contacted the Massachusetts State Police and federal marshals, who were not connected to the local network of corruption. The raid on St. Catherine's Academy revealed horrors that exceeded even Ashworth's expectations. In Victoria, Whitman's private safe investigators found detailed records of 127 girls who had been trafficked through the academy over 13 years. 68 of them had been murdered when they were no longer useful, including the 24 girls whose names would eventually give this case its enduring notoriety. The evidence also revealed the scope of the client network. The list included not just Massachusetts officials, but wealthy men from across New England and New York. Among them were 3 federal judges, 12 state legislators, 5 mayors, and dozens of prominent businessmen and religious leaders. The scandal would eventually reach as high as a member of Congress and a federal cabinet member. Victoria Whitman was arrested while attempting to flee to Canada with a suitcase full of gold coins and jewelry that had been payment from clients. Agnes Murphy was found in the basement of the academy, destroying evidence in the crematorium, where so many girls had met their end. The false father Ali had disappeared completely and was never found. The trials that followed were among the most sensational in Massachusetts history. Victoria Whitman, facing overwhelming evidence, maintained her innocence until the end, claiming that she had been running a legitimate orphanage, and that any evidence to the contrary had been fabricated by her enemies. She was convicted on 68 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Agnes Murphy attempted to claim that she had been coerced by Whitman, but the evidence showed that she had been an enthusiastic participant in the operation's most violent aspects. She was convicted on 43 counts of murder and also sentenced to death. Martha Caldwell, in exchange for her cooperation, received a sentence of life in prison. She would spend the remaining 32 years of her life in the Massachusetts State Prison for Women, where, ironically, she became known for her work helping other female prisoners learn to read and write. Dr. Webb, faced with the choice between cooperation and prosecution, provided detailed testimony about his role in the conspiracy. His medical records were crucial in establishing the pattern of abuse and murder. He was convicted of accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but died of a heart attack less than 2 years into his sentence. The investigation into the client network proved more problematic. Many of the men named in Victoria Whitman's records had the resources to hire the best lawyers and the connections to influence the legal process. Some fled the country, others destroyed evidence, and still others simply denied any involvement despite overwhelming proof of their crimes. Judge Harrison Cromwell was found dead in his study 3 days before he was scheduled to testify, apparently having committed suicide rather than face public disgrace. Several other clients met similar fates, leading to speculation that they had been murdered to prevent them from implicating others in the conspiracy. In the end, only 12 of the more than 50 clients identified in the records were successfully prosecuted. The others escaped justice through a combination of wealth influence and the reluctance of authorities to pursue cases that would embarrass prominent members of society. The physical evidence of the crimes was undeniable. Excavation of the basement crematorium revealed bone fragments and personal effects belonging to dozens of victims. The mass grave outside Marblehead yielded the remains of the 3 genuine nuns along with several other unidentified victims. The academy building itself was destroyed by an angry mob before authorities could stop them. Emma Prescott, whose suspicions had helped expose the conspiracy, was initially hailed as a hero, but she found that her newfound fame came with a terrible price. Many people blamed her for destroying the reputations of prominent men, and she received death threats from those who believed she should have remained silent. She eventually moved to California, where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1891. The case of St. Catherine's Academy led to significant reforms in how orphanages and charitable institutions were monitored in Massachusetts. New laws required regular inspections, detailed record keeping, and verification of staff credentials. Similar reforms were implemented throughout New England as other states sought to prevent similar tragedies. But perhaps the most important outcome of the case was that it finally gave names and identities to girls who had been erased from history. The 24 girls whose disappearance had initially puzzled investigators were revealed to be Mary O'Brien, age 13, murdered in 1837 after attempting to escape; Sarah Thompson, age 15, killed in 1839 when she contracted tuberculosis; Catherine Murphy, age 12, beaten to death in 1840 when she refused to comply with a client's demands; and 21 others ranging in age from 12 to 17 each, with their own story of a life cut short by the cruelty of adults who should have protected them. A memorial was erected in Salem's Green Lawn Cemetery bearing all their names, paid for by public subscription. The inscription reads, "In memory of the innocent victims of St. Catherine's Academy, may their names never be forgotten and may their suffering never be repeated." Detective William Ashworth was promoted and eventually became Chief of Police in Boston, a position he used to continue investigating similar cases throughout New England. He never married and dedicated his life to protecting children from the kind of predators he had encountered at St. Catherine's Academy. He died in 1889, still carrying the guilt of not having discovered the conspiracy sooner. The building that had housed St. Catherine's Academy was never rebuilt. The land remained empty for decades, eventually becoming a small park where children could play safely. Local legend claims that on certain nights, visitors to the park can hear the sound of young voices singing lullabies, as if the spirits of the murdered girls were finally at peace. The case file for St. Catherine's Academy remains one of the most requested records in the Massachusetts State Archives. Researchers, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts continue to study the case, looking for answers to questions that may never be fully resolved. How many other institutions like St. Catherine's Academy operated without detection? How many powerful men escaped justice for their crimes? And how many other children suffered similar fates without anyone ever learning their names? What we do know is that the evil that flourished at St. Catherine's Academy was not supernatural or otherworldly. It was purely human evil, perpetrated by people who chose profit over compassion, power over protection, and silence over justice. The real horror of this story is not that it involved ghosts or demons, but that it involved people who were supposed to be guardians and protectors. The 24 girls who never left St. Catherine's Academy finally found peace not through supernatural intervention, but through the courage of people like Emma Prescott and Detective Ashworth, who refused to let their deaths be forgotten. Their names are carved in stone now, permanent reminders that even the most vulnerable members of society deserve justice, protection, and remembrance. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors are often hidden behind facades of respectability and virtue. The most dangerous predators are not strangers lurking in shadows, but trusted figures who use their positions of authority to exploit those under their care. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there have been even darker secrets that died with Victoria Whitman? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is often more terrifying than any ghost story, and there are many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next video.